The Pacific theater of World War II is often remembered through iconic events such as the Battle of Midway, the struggle for Guadalcanal, the landing on Iwo Jima, or the kamikaze attacks. Yet, beyond the dominant narrative centered on naval and air power, there lies a lesser-known but strategically pivotal ground engagement, the Battle of Milne Bay. Overshadowed in public memory, it remains buried in the mud, jungles, and complex decision-making of the conflict. Fought from August 25 to September 7, 1942, at Milne Bay on the eastern tip of the Papuan Peninsula, the battle, though far smaller in scale than the massive warfare on the Eastern Front or the Normandy invasion, marked the first decisive defeat of Imperial Japanese ground forces in the Pacific War. The outcome carried symbolic weight and exerted significant influence on Allied strategy in both the Solomon Islands and New Guinea campaigns. The origins of the battle lay not in gunfire, but in strategic miscalculation. Following the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Japan intended to seize the Papuan region to sever supply routes between the United States and Australia and to place pressure on Australia's defensive perimeter. However, after losing carrier capability and failing to secure Port Moresby in the Coral Sea engagement, the plan had temporarily stalled. Still, Japanese military leadership did not abandon the idea of controlling eastern New Guinea. They believed that establishing an operational airfield in the area would enable them to dominate the Torres Strait from the air, restricting Allied mobility and hindering future counteroffensives. Milne Bay, due to its deep natural harbor and proximity to the Solomon Islands front, was soon incorporated into Japan's strategy of expansion and fortified defense. Meanwhile, Allied headquarters, particularly in Brisbane under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific Area, had also recognized Milne Bay's strategic value. Intelligence from the Air Force and Navy alerted MacArthur to the likelihood of a Japanese advance toward the Papuan Peninsula. In response, he ordered the deployment of the Australian 7th and 18th Brigades, along with U.S. Army engineer units, to Milne Bay to construct airfields and supply installations. Command authority was placed under Major General Cyril Close of the Australian Army. When the Australians arrived, Milne Bay was little more than untouched tropical jungle and swamp. Heavy tropical rainfall, dense mosquitoes, and rampant malaria added immense strain to logistics and morale. Constructing a functional airstrip capable of supporting fighter operations on the soft, waterlogged soil proved exceptionally difficult. U.S. Navy Seabees and Australian engineers employed compacted coral surfacing techniques and progressively completed 2 operational runways. By early August 1942, the Allied garrison had grown to more than 8,000 personnel, including No. 75 and No. 76 squadrons of the Royal Australian Air Force, equipped with P-40 Kitty Hawk fighters. Yet Japanese intelligence severely underestimated these developments. The Imperial Japanese 17th Army staff believed that the airfields were still incomplete and that the garrison consisted mainly of logistics personnel. They expected that a swift night landing by elite naval infantry would be sufficient to destroy the airfields and secure the area. Thus, the 5th Special Naval Landing Force, SNLF, was assigned to the operation, led by the experienced commander Saiki-Maki Kajiura. Having previously taken part in successful operations in Rabaul and Bougainville, Kajiura retained strong confidence in rapid assaults and night combat doctrine. His conviction stemmed both from Japan's earlier success across the Pacific and from institutionalized military culture that prioritized morale, bayonet charges, and night attacks as decisive tactics. On the night of August 25, Japanese landing vessels entered the northeastern approaches to Milne Bay under humid, misty conditions with moderate seas. The landing plan divided forces into 2 points, near Robbie Bay and near the Wagga Wagga area. The landing force numbered roughly 1,900 men, with several light tanks, an unusual feature in the otherwise infantry-focused island campaigns. The force quickly established a beachhead under cover of darkness and began advancing toward the airfields. At the same time, Allied aerial reconnaissance had already detected and confirmed Japanese movements. General Close responded calmly, ordering a deliberate tactical withdrawal to draw the Japanese deeper into the jungle, rather than confronting them immediately under conditions favorable to Japanese night assault doctrine. This decision illustrated a stark contrast in operational philosophy. Whereas Japanese forces relied on shock, momentum, and aggressive close-quarters action, the Australian defence emphasised measured planning, positional advantage, and disciplined response. With these manoeuvres, The Battle of Milne Bay entered its brutal and decisive phase. In the first hours after the Japanese landing, the battlefield reflected the typical characteristics of combat in the Pacific rainforest: thick darkness, slippery terrain, and a canopy so dense that even faint moonlight could not penetrate. Soldiers often found themselves less than 20 meters from one another, yet unable to distinguish friend from foe. As planned, the Japanese 5th Special Naval Landing Force advanced rapidly along old jungle trails near the coast, while a smaller detachment attempted reconnaissance toward the outskirts of the airfield. Although the initial movements were smooth, the Japanese soon realized they were not facing the undefended airstrip assumed by their staff officers, but rather a fully developed defensive system held by elements of the Australian 7th and 18th Brigades, including infantry, machine gun companies, anti-aircraft units, and engineers. At dawn on August 26, the Japanese vanguard encountered the 61st Battalion of the Australian Army near Robbie. Australian troops utilized natural defensive lines formed by the sodden terrain, engaging in close-quarters combat. Initial probing rifle fire quickly escalated into fierce fighting involving grenades, light machine guns, and bayonets. The Japanese adhered to their usual doctrine of night assault and close-range combat, while the Australians relied on the suppressive fire of Bren light machine guns and coordinated counterattacks via radio, a tactical advantage that would become increasingly decisive. When daylight broke, the battle dynamics shifted. Air support became a determining factor. RAF P-40 fighters took off at first light, conducting low-level strafing runs and bombing attacks along the Japanese advance routes. For an army confident that offensive spirit alone could overwhelm the enemy, the lack of effective anti-aircraft defenses and suitable cover rendered daylight movement nearly impossible. Commander Kishimoto understood that if his forces failed to achieve their objectives during the night, they would be rendered immobile under the combined pressure of mud, disease, and air attack. Meanwhile, Major General Cyril Close, commanding the Australian forces, did not allow his early success to push him into a reckless counter-offensive. Instead, he maintained a conservative strategy, using terrain and layered defenses to wear down the enemy. Close understood that although the Australians held strong defensive positions and air superiority, many of his troops lacked long-term combat experience in tropical jungles, and their supply lines were far from perfect. In other words, delaying the enemy was not merely a defensive tactic, it was a battle against terrain, time, and attrition. From August 27 to 29, the fighting reached its most intense phase. 2 Type 95 Argo light tanks were brought forward near Wagga Wagga to force a breakthrough against the Australian infantry positions. With armoured support, Japanese troops temporarily regained momentum and pushed the Australians back nearly 2 kilometers. However, the tanks soon became bogged down in deep mud, where Australian troops destroyed them using anti-tank rifles, improvised incendiary bottles, and trench-based ambushes. The failure of mechanized forces under such conditions became a classic case study and later informed Allied jungle warfare doctrine throughout the Pacific. As the advance stalled, Japanese logistical problems became increasingly severe. Rough seas and Allied air attacks damaged landing craft, and much of the landed supply stock rapidly spoiled in the tropical climate. During lulls in combat, soldiers often survived on primitive water sources and limited rations, while disease, particularly malaria, dengue fever, and fungal skin infections, rapidly degraded combat capability. Allied post-war analysis estimated that over 40% of Japanese casualties were non-battle losses due to illness. By contrast, although Australian forces also suffered from disease, their logistical network remained functional, with medical services and supply depots continuing operations. The presence of U.S. Army engineers and supply units at Milne Bay ensured that damaged runways were repaired quickly, allowing continued and effective air operations. On the night of August 30th, the Japanese launched their largest assault of the campaign. Kishimoto ordered a mass night attack in heavy rain, hoping that concentrated manpower and fighting spirit would overcome Australian defenses. Advancing through mud and water, Japanese troops relied primarily on rifles, bayonets, and machine guns. However, the Australians anticipated the attack and prepared illumination flares and mortar fire zones. Crossing fields of overlapping fire, many Japanese soldiers were forced to crawl under exhaustion and constant suppression, unable to break the line. The battle continued until dawn on August 31st, when the Japanese offensive collapsed entirely. With mounting casualties, Kishimoto reluctantly considered withdrawal, an act contrary to Japanese military doctrine, where retreat without mission success was considered unacceptable. Still, he ordered his forces to hold position and requested reinforcements from Rabaul. Yet by this time, the Japanese navy, stretched thin and reeling from the escalating Guadalcanal campaign, could no longer support operations at Milne Bay. After heated debate, High Command authorized evacuation, marking the first acknowledged Japanese ground defeat since the attack on Pearl Harbor. With the Japanese attack halted, the Australians seized the initiative. Close ordered a full counter-offensive. Between September 4 and 7, Australian troops cleared remaining Japanese positions as surviving enemy forces attempted to withdraw toward the coast under cover of darkness. In the early hours of September 7, Japanese naval vessels extracted the remaining troops, fewer than half of the original landing strength. The Battle of Milne Bay was over. Though won by the Allies, its significance extended beyond tactical success. The battle shattered the myth of Japanese ground invincibility and demonstrated that in the Pacific jungle environment, air power, logistics, and adaptive training outweighed sheer morale and frontal assault tactics. After the Battle of Milne Bay concluded, the battlefield presented a complex yet unmistakable combination of military and symbolic significance. For the Allied forces, the outcome represented more than just a localized victory, it marked both a strategic breakthrough and a psychological turning point. For the Japanese, however, the defeat became one of the key moments when the momentum in the Pacific War began shifting from offensive expansion to defensive resistance. Post-battle inspections and intelligence recovery revealed that Japanese forces had abandoned a substantial amount of supplies, weapons, tactical maps, and even partially unsecured operational logs during their withdrawal. These materials became valuable intelligence assets for Australian and U.S. military intelligence agencies, offering insight into Japan's broader strategic intentions, troop deployment methods, and logistical structures in the South Pacific theater. This information later proved particularly useful during the Solomon Islands, Bougainville, and New Guinea mountain campaigns, helping Allied strategists refine operational planning with greater precision. Although Australian casualties were considerably lower than Japan's, the losses were still significant. Official post-war data indicates that during the Battle of Milne Bay, the Allied forces suffered approximately 373 killed and more than 800 wounded, while Japanese losses exceeded 1,000, nearly half of which resulted not from direct combat but from disease, dehydration, or becoming lost in the jungle. Subsequent military medical assessments further concluded that the harsh terrain and climate of Milne Bay inflicted physical and psychological damage nearly equivalent to battlefield wounds. The findings prompted the Allies to place far greater emphasis on disease prevention, drinking water sanitation, specialized equipment for tropical warfare, and structured training for jungle combat throughout the remainder of the Pacific Campaign. One Australian infantryman who fought at Milne Bay later wrote in his memoir, "We believed the enemy would be our greatest threat, but it wasn't bullets that brought men down first, it was insects, rain, mud, and sickness. You could avoid a bullet, but you couldn't escape the monsoon." While certainly personal and emotional in tone, medical casualty statistics indicate that his words were neither exaggeration nor poetic dramatization, but rather an accurate reflection of a shared Pacific theater truth. At the same time, the battle exposed critical flaws in Japanese strategic assumptions. Relying heavily on earlier wartime successes, the Japanese general staff believed that rapid land seizure and night combat superiority would be sufficient against defending forces, failing to account for the rapidly expanding Allied air power in the region. Compounding this misjudgment, Japanese logistical doctrine continued to rely on high-speed raiding fleets and lightly armored supply ships. While initially advantageous, these vessels became dangerously vulnerable once Allied aircraft gained operational reach. Only after Milne Bay did Japan fully realize the strategic consequences of lacking air superiority, yet by then, reversing the disadvantage was no longer realistically possible. It is notable that several key figures from the battle experienced sharply contrasting reputations after the war. Major General Cyril Close, commander of the Australian forces, demonstrated composure and disciplined military judgment throughout the campaign. Although the defense of Milne Bay was ultimately successful, some of Close's superiors criticized him for not exploiting the victory more aggressively. General Douglas MacArthur in particular offered little praise, arguing that Close lacked an offensive spirit. As a result, Close did not receive higher strategic command despite the successful outcome. In later military scholarship, this assessment has been widely debated, with some historians arguing that it reflected political relationships more than military merit. As historian John Brewster wrote in Turning Point in the South Pacific, Close was never cast as a heroic figure in the traditional narrative of the war, yet from the perspective of military science, he was among the few Pacific commanders who remained rational, methodical, and unshaken by emotional impulse or doctrinal convention. In contrast, the legacy of Japanese commander Colonel Shoji Kashimoto is considerably more complex. After the war, he became a point of criticism within Japanese military circles, often portrayed as lacking adaptability in his tactical decisions. However, later research demonstrated that the strategic and operational framework guiding Milne Bay was not his own independent design, but rather tightly constrained by directives from the Imperial General Headquarters. Some modern scholars therefore argue that it is overly simplistic, and historically inaccurate, to attribute the defeat solely to Kashimoto, as the larger South Pacific Command structure was already operating under flawed assumptions shaped by earlier wartime success. The broader strategic significance of the Battle of Milne Bay did not fully reveal itself immediately, yet its long-term impact on the Pacific War was structurally meaningful. Its influence can be summarized in three primary dimensions. Symbolic impact. It marked the first instance in which Allied ground forces successfully defended against and decisively defeated a Japanese land assault in the Pacific theater, shattering the myth of Japanese invincibility and greatly boosting Allied morale. Geostrategic value. The battle ensured Allied control of Milne Bay's airfields and supply harbor, transforming the area into a critical staging point for the New Guinea counteroffensives. Aircraft launched from Milne Bay later played a key role in supporting the Guadalcanal campaign. Operational and tactical lessons. The experience provided the Allies with a clearer understanding of how to counter Japanese night assaults, fight effectively in jungle conditions, and manage health and logistics in tropical environments. These lessons became essential in later campaigns including Kokoda Track, Lai, and Bougainville. Decades after the battle, shell casings, runway traces, and collapsed trenches could still be found in the region. Local oral histories preserve the battle as a defining memory, while Australian military institutions and historians took many years to fully acknowledge its significance. Over time, Milne Bay evolved from what some once called a forgotten victory into a recognised milestone representing Australia's independent military capability. Yet in the broader international narrative of the war, Milne Bay remains a moment half in shadow, less decisive than Midway, less drawn out and brutal than Guadalcanal, and far less catastrophic than Iwo Jima or Okinawa. It was neither grand nor tragic in scale, but through precise execution and grounded military logic, it quietly marked the beginning of a strategic shift in the Pacific balance of power. It was not a heroic epic, rather, it was a cold, incisive lesson in the reality of war. From a broader perspective, the historical significance of the Battle of Milne Bay cannot be measured solely by its military outcome. Instead, its importance lies within a multi-layered structure of wartime memory, historiography, and the evolution of strategic thinking. It represents a case that is limited in scale but structurally complex, possessing enough depth to be placed within theoretical discussions of warfare. From a military history standpoint, it serves as a textbook example of a successful defensive operation under conditions of limited resources. From a political history perspective, it marks a symbolic turning point when Allied forces shifted from passive resistance to gradual counteroffensive. And within the broader narrative framework of world history, it is an event overshadowed by larger battles, yet one that influenced numerous subsequent operational decisions. Milne Bay and post-war historiographical frameworks. In the early post-war years, discussions of the Battle of Milne Bay remained relatively limited. The first systematic military historical research appeared in the late 1950s. At that time, dominant narratives favored a grand strategic interpretation that framed the Pacific War primarily as a conflict governed by naval and air power, rendering land engagements comparatively marginal. As a result, Milne Bay remained overlooked for decades. However, from the late 1960s through the 1970s, the emergence and compilation of oral histories from veterans prompted researchers to reassess the battle. They began to recognize its unique characteristics, in an extreme environment marked by challenging terrain, asymmetric air superiority, complex logistical demands, and mutual unfamiliarity with jungle warfare, Australian forces successfully executed both tactical and command-level adaptation. This shift in research eventually repositioned Milne Bay from a forgotten small engagement to a turning point in Pacific jungle warfare. American military historian William L. Casewood famously remarked, "If Midway proved to the United States that Japan could be defeated, Milne Bay proved to the Allies that Japan could be stopped, on land, weakened, and pushed back." Though interpretive in tone, his statement accurately captures the psychological impact of the battle. Milne Bay altered the Allied mindset. Characteristics in comparative international military context. When examined alongside other ground engagements of World War II, the Battle of Milne Bay stands out for several defining features. The first decisive use of air superiority in a jungle ground campaign. Unlike earlier operations in Malaya, Singapore, or the Philippines, in which air power played a secondary and supportive function, Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, aircraft at Milne Bay conducted reconnaissance and executed precision strikes that directly slowed Japanese advances. The first systematic demonstration of the strategic value of logistics and environmental adaptation. The Imperial Japanese Army's long-standing doctrine of light, rapid maneuvering proved inadequate. The lack of supply capability became a critical vulnerability, while Allied forces extended the duration and sustainability of the defensive effort through a secured supply line. A catalyst for the transformation of jungle warfare doctrine. The battle contributed to the development of a tactical framework distinct from the European model, including reliance on 10-man tactical teams rather than large unit advances, expanded counter-night assault and anti-bayonet charge doctrine, widespread integration of mortars and air-guided fire support, formal incorporation of disease control into operational planning. These features later shaped the battle models used in Lae, Buna, and the Huon Peninsula campaigns. 3. Battlefield archaeology and material evidence. Beginning in the 1990s, archaeological teams from Australia, Papua New Guinea, and several international institutions initiated surveys in the Milne Bay region. Although decades of vegetation regrowth have obscured much of the terrain, several physical remnants have been identified, including collapsed or partially preserved trench systems, coral-compacted runway foundations, heavily corroded Type 95 Argo tank armor fragments, shell casings, personal effects, and glass medical vials. Remnants of Japanese infantry cooking implements and bayonet fragments. These findings have verified numerous details preserved in historical accounts. Soil analysis from a documented Japanese withdrawal route revealed bone fragments and rust concentrations, leading researchers to conclude that it served as a temporary burial site during retreat. One notable discovery was the presence of significant medical equipment and quinine bottle fragments, demonstrating that Allied planning addressed not only tactical concerns but also disease and environmental challenges, a model later replicated throughout Pacific ground operations. The battle in memoirs and personal accounts. As surviving participants diminished, their recorded memories became another essential source of evidence. Australian soldier Harold Kensington wrote in his memoir, "The rain did not fall, it hung in the air. Every breath tasted of mud, rot, and rust. We knew the enemy was 50 meters away, yet we could not see him. Waiting was the hardest battle." A Japanese infantryman recorded in his wartime diary, "Our boots sank into the mud, and when we pulled our feet free, the earth tried to keep the shoes. We were hungry and exhausted, yet we marched. Honor and loyalty demanded that we continue, but the body was more truthful than the spirit." Despite contrasting perspectives, these accounts reveal a consistent truth: Milne Bay was a battle of endurance, not merely a test of tactics or firepower. War narratives and divergent national memory. Australia, Japan, and the United States interpret the Battle of Milne Bay through different narrative lenses. Australian narrative, a symbol of independent national military capability. Japanese narrative, a minimized episode attributed to exceptional environmental conditions. American narrative, part of a broader regional victory rather than a decisive standalone battle. These divergent interpretations reflect differences in how nations construct and preserve wartime memory. Historical narrative is not merely documentation, it is a selective reconstruction shaped by politics, cultural identity, public sentiment, and national self-perception. Thus, Milne Bay occupies distinct roles within national memory: a defining victory in Australia, a softened failure in Japan, and a supporting engagement in the United States. The Battle of Milne Bay was not a large-scale confrontation that reshaped the world, yet it served as a critical structural turning point. It halted Allied retreat, shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility on land, and shifted military thinking from valor-centered doctrine to one grounded in technology, logistics, and adaptive strategy. It was not the climax of the war, but it was the condition that made the climax possible. The logical structure of the Milne Bay campaign is a strategic turning point. In the early phase of the Pacific War, Japan leveraged highly trained forces, well-coordinated combined arms operations, and tactical flexibility to rapidly seize large territories. During this period, the Allied forces demonstrated significant shortcomings, reflected in three key areas. Japan controlled the strategic tempo. The Allied supply system lacked coherent planning. Tactical doctrine remained rooted in traditional European land warfare paradigms. However, the Battle of Milne Bay revealed a new structural pattern. Japan failed for the first time to achieve a strategic advantage through rapid offensive momentum. The Allies not only held their ground but successfully preserved critical infrastructure, most notably, the airfields. Environmental factors emerged for the first time as decisive variables, incorporated into operational logic by the Allies rather than by Japan. In other words, this battle forced Japan to recognize that the Pacific was not an ever-expanding, obstacle-free map, but a massive attrition battlefield requiring sustained occupation capability, reliable logistics, and adaptation to harsh environments. On the strategic level, the Battle of Milne Bay marked the end of Japan's expansion phase and the beginning of the Allies' gradual control over the tempo of the war. Success within failure, structural misjudgments in Japanese military practice. Analysis of Japan's defeat at Milne Bay reveals that the outcome was not caused by lack of training or insufficient fighting spirit, but rather by strategic thinking that failed to adapt to the evolving nature of warfare. Japanese tactics in the 1930s remained influenced by World War I doctrine, grounded in the belief that willpower, offensive initiative, and close-quarters assault would determine victory. These concepts repeatedly proved effective in North China, Southeast Asia, and the early South Pacific campaigns, reinforcing psychological inertia and institutional confidence. However, at Milne Bay, the character of warfare had changed. In an operational environment defined by jungle terrain, mud, and disease, traditional concepts of decisive battle were no longer sufficient. Lacking secure logistics, tactical maneuver space, and air superiority, Japanese combat methods became rigid and ineffective. Thus, Milne Bay was not merely a defeat, it exposed the Japanese army's inability to adapt its tactical system to battlefield realities. From the perspective of military thought evolution, it stands as a classic example of the collision between outdated doctrine and a new systemic form of warfare. Warning within victory, Allied lessons and systemic evolution. Although the Allies won the battle, the victory did not conceal internal problems. Military archives and post-war assessments reveal three major vulnerabilities. Ground forces lacked adequate training for jungle warfare. Medical systems existed but were not fully prepared for the scale of tropical disease. Command networks suffered from delays and coordination friction. These issues prompted the Australian and U.S. armies to restructure training and develop equipment suitable for tropical conditions, including improved combat uniforms designed for heat and humidity, enhanced personal hygiene and anti-insect gear, more reliable portable communication systems. Therefore, Milne Bay was not only a battlefield victory, it became a critical catalyst for upgrades in training doctrine, equipment systems, and operational thinking. The battle's position in military theory. Modern military scholarship increasingly classifies the Battle of Milne Bay as a model case of a successful defense of a high-value objective with limited force commitment. Such engagements share four common characteristics. The defending force lacks overwhelming manpower but holds strategically vital terrain. The attacking force relies on speed and shock rather than sustained supply or attrition capability. Terrain and environmental conditions act as primary operational constraints. Air power plays a decisive supporting role outweighing ground firepower alone. For this reason, Milne Bay is now included in military academy curricula as an example illustrating that War is not a contest of singular strength, but a systemic competition shaped by multiple interacting variables. Historical significance and conclusion: the long echo of a small battle. The Battle of Milne Bay lacks grand narrative drama. It is neither celebrated as a symbol of liberation like Normandy, nor remembered as a test of national endurance like Stalingrad. Yet its value lies elsewhere. Milne Bay demonstrated that victory in war is not always achieved through mass, spectacle, or heroism, but through discipline, patience, and accurate assessment of reality. If major historical turning points shine with symbolic brilliance, the Battle of Milne Bay embodies a quieter but resolute force, a victory achieved not through myth or momentum, but through adaptability, analytical clarity, and tactical realism. Thus, it deserves remembrance. Not because it was monumental, but because it was true, rational, and pragmatic. Just as warfare is not mythology, but a harsh dialogue about survival, structure, strategy, and cost. Ultimately, the legacy of Milne Bay delivers a clear message. In war, victory does not belong to those who cling to past methods, but to those who understand change, reshape the rules, and endure to the end.